Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Committee on Scottish Government Handling of Harassment Complaints. Our first item of business is a decision to take the committee's work programme discussion at next week's meeting in private. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. We'll then move on to agenda item 2. I won't repeat my full statement from our meeting on 18th of August, but I would remind all those present and watching that we are bound by the terms of our remit and the relevant court orders, including the need to avoid contempt of court by identifying certain individuals, including through jigsaw identification. The committee as a whole has also agreed that it is not our role to revisit events that were a focus of the trial, as that could be seen to constitute a rerun of the criminal trial. Our remit is clear. It is to consider and report on the actions of the First Minister, Scottish Government officials and special advisers in dealing with complaints about Alex Salmond, former First Minister, considered under the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints involving current or former ministers and procedure and actions in relation to the Scottish Ministerial Code. The more we get into specifics of evidence, the more we run the risk of identifying those who made complaints. The more we ask about specific matters covered in the trial, including events explored in the trial, the more we run the risk of rerunning that trial. Wherever possible, can witnesses, as well as members, please avoid discussion of the specifics of concerns or complaints, including those that predated the harassment complaints procedure being produced, and also avoid naming specific government officials. With that, I welcome Sir Peter Housden, who was Permanent Secretary from 2010 to 2015. And I begin by inviting Sir Peter to take the solemn affirmation. Please, Sir Peter, raise your right hand and repeat after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm.
Solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Sir Peter. I now invite you to make your opening statement for around 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Convener. I served as Permanent Secretary to the Scottish Government from 2010 to 2015 after a career in public service in England as a Director of Education and Chief Executive in a major local authority, and as a Director General and Permanent Secretary in Whitehall. As Permanent Secretary in the Scottish Government, I had a dual role as Principal Policy Advisor to the First Minister and the Cabinet, and as Head of the Civil Service in the Scottish Government. As a former civil servant, I have no access to Scottish Government documents. I shall therefore be relying on my memory of events and circumstances now a number of years in the past. I'm also bound by the restrictions and legal obligations arising from the legal proceedings in the Court of Session, and I'm particularly mindful of my obligation to protect the anonymity of the complainants whose testimony gave rise to those proceedings. I'm also subject to the obligations on confidentiality imposed on former civil servants by the Civil Servants Management Code. Within these constraints, I shall, of course, do all I can to assist the committee. For full transparency, I should declare I served in the Scottish Government whilst a number of members of this committee were in ministerial roles and remain a member of the FDA. Thank you, Convener, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sir Peter, and we'll move directly to these questions now. Now, first of all, move to our Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Sir Peter. You've already said that you were Permanent Secretary from 2010 to 2015, and in 2010 the Fairness to Work policy was revised and included complaints against ministers. Would you confirm when the 2010 Fairness to Work policy was signed off?
My understanding is that it was signed off before I arrived as Permanent Secretary.
Certain documents refer to as being completed September 2010.
I'm sure they are right, but it's in terms of its gestation and development, it was before my time as Permanent Secretary.
Okay. Well, we know that your predecessor, Sir John Elvidge, was involved in the development of the ministerial complaints aspect of the policy. Were you involved at all in this aspect?
No, not in relation to the Scottish Government policy.
Or to the ministerial complaints inclusion?
No, that was all done and dusted by the time I arrived in Scotland.
Right. Well, how and by whom were you briefed about the background to this new policy when you took up office?
One of my concerns, obviously, coming into post was to ensure that the Scottish Government had a raft of highly competent staff in its different senior functions, and that we had a full set of suite, if you like, of appropriate policies. And those concerning human relations were obviously particularly important. I was well briefed by the Director of HR on a number of aspects concerning the overall arrangements. You'll appreciate that there are a whole suite of HR policies. We didn't go through each one in detail. I was aware they were there and could call on specialist advice, including legal advice, where necessary if their interpretation became an issue. But I satisfied myself that we had in both those respects, in terms of the competence, experience of staff, and in terms of the suite of policies we had available.
As part of the handover process, did Sir John brief you on anything?
I benefited from an extensive set of briefings with John Elvidge before I took up post, yes.
And did that cover aspects to do with the fairness to work policy, which we know he was concerned about?
No.
No. Okay, did you have any misgivings when the fairness at work policy was signed off and it did not provide for independent investigation of harassment concerns or complaints against ministers?
That was not an issue for me.
Okay. Finally, in your submission, you state the limiting cases were, of course, situations where a formal complaint was brought against a minister and/or there was presenting evidence that an egregious act had been committed. In these cases, formal procedures were followed. Now, we know under the Fairness at Work policy, this means the complaint would be passed on to you as Permanent Secretary and to Nicola Sturgeon as the Deputy First Minister. Can you confirm whether these formal complaints involved harassment complaints against ministers, including the former First Minister?
Can I just clarify your question again?
Yeah.
Could you help me?
Can you confirm whether these formal complaints, because we'd reached the formal complaints side of the process or stage of the process, whether these formal complaints involved harassment complaints against ministers, including the former First Minister?
We're talking hypothetically here, from my experience, because in my time as Permanent Secretary, there were no formal complaints made against ministers in any respect, bullying, harassment, or any other regard.
Yeah, so that's in that case, it's a little bit misleading, your statement. It says limiting cases were, of course, situations where a formal complaint was brought against a minister and there was presenting evidence that an egregious act had been committed. In these cases, formal procedure would be followed. It sounded as though you were referring to specifics, because my understanding was if it couldn't be dealt with informally, it had to go to the formal procedure.
I'm happy to clarify. I'm speaking there across the range of my experience, and again, hypothetically, because extraordinarily as it may sound now, in those years, stretching back to into the 1990s, no formal complaints came forward against any elected politician in any of the environments in which I worked. What I was seeking to lay out thereby was, in the absence of formal complaints or egregious acts, known egregious acts, one used informal mechanisms to move forward situations where you knew there was a concern.
So were you aware of, and last question, were you aware of concerns expressed if they didn't actually get to the stage of being a formal complaint about harassment, including ministers or former ministers, including the former First Minister?
I knew that the former First Minister could display bullying and intimidatory behaviour, yes.
Asked specifically about harassment.
Well, I'm not sure exactly how you would define harassment, but bullying and intimidatory behaviour, I knew he could display those behaviours.
Forgive me, Sir Peter, as Permanent Secretary, shouldn't it have been your business to be able to define harassment and understand what that meant when it was when it came before you, or a suggestion of it came before you?
Well, in terms of a tight legalistic definition, I would rely on lawyers and HR folk. But in terms of an everyday understanding of the way that staff might be affected by behaviour, I think I could recognise it as well as anybody else could. And as I indicated, I knew the situation we were dealing with.
And for the avoidance of doubt, did you speak to the Deputy First Minister about any of these harassment complaints?
I'm not able to go into specifics in terms of individuals.
I don't think that's so specific. The Deputy First Minister had a role in the process, so it's merely a question.
I'm not able to identify, due to the duty of confidentiality, people to whom I spoke. In my evidence, I did indicate that where it was appropriate in both Scotland and in other settings, one had a word with another senior politician.
Mm-hmm. I think, Convener, there is a point of order here. Continually we've been told that, you know, there's confidentiality under the Ministerial Code, but this is an inquiry of the Parliament into the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints. You are a witness here to facts and events, and it's on that basis I'm asking you that question.
And I am bound, as I explained, by the provisions of the Civil Service Management Code in terms of confidentiality, which clearly extends to my dealings with individual ministers.
Yeah, can I ask Sir Peter, as part of your role, would it have been appropriate if you had concerns about ministers' behaviour to speak to the Deputy First Minister?
It would be appropriate in all the settings I worked to speak with a senior member of the administration concerned, yes. But I'm not thereby confirming to whom I spoke on these matters in Scotland.
But it would have been appropriate under normal procedure
Yes.
of the government.
Yes.
Thank you. Move on to Alistair Allen, followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. You've said, Sir Peter, that you were aware of concerns, and your statement describes, or I think some of the evidence you provided us describes the safe spaces which were created in which such concerns could be raised. Without talking about individuals here, do you feel that those safe spaces that were created were successful as forums in allowing people to bring forward complaints? You've said that no complaints were brought forward.
Thank you. In terms of safe spaces, I think that is more indicative of two things. One, that we took as a senior group a number of measures to enable all staff to feel better supported and to have a closer dialogue with their line manager. That was important because the variation in contact and quality between line managers and their staff was variable. So the introduction of, we called it the monthly conversation, was designed to close that gap and refer to the safe space that you provided. Now, it is possible that in such a space, those type of concerns might be raised. They might, of course, be raised outside them. Our concern was to make sure that there was a bedrock of trust and information exchange between the line manager and the individual to promote that. Of course, it remains the case that a member of staff, might choose to go to another person altogether, another civil servant with whom they had a relationship and had an existing relationship of trust. So it helped with the general climate rather than being the only channel that you would make available to people.
Thank you. You've also stated in your evidence that all reasonable steps were taken in your time as Permanent Secretary to ensure that the culture and procedures within the civil service were appropriate to our task and to meet our duty of care to staff. And you've also said that complaints were dealt with, or concerns rather, were dealt with on an ad hominem or perhaps ad feminam basis. But you've mentioned reasonable steps. So what were the reasonable steps that were taken in these type of situations?
Well, I'd say, I'm speaking generally here, that these are endemic in situations where you've got a gross imbalance of power, in the Scottish case between the First Minister and a rank and file civil servant. And you've got what I called in my evidence an asymmetry of accountability, because, to be short, civil servants do not have a line of accountability from ministers. Ministers are accountable to this Parliament. So you've got those sort of gaps. So in those circumstances, where you hadn't got a formal complaint and there was no known egregious act, informal means were the only ones that are available. What did I do here? Well, specifically and in general terms, I ensured that staffing issues were brought to the Cabinet quite regularly. In terms, particularly, we had an annual report on the staff survey and what that said about morale and the general condition of the civil service at a time of great pressure in the work of the Scottish Government. And I made frequent oral references to the First Minister and to other ministers as I went about my business on the importance of morale and motivation amongst staff. Now, I'm not able, as I've said, to discuss individual cases and situations, but where there were specific instances and concerns in Scotland and elsewhere, I would do three things. First of all, I'd make sure the staff were supported and had a sympathetic listening environment, and then that I understood the specific circumstances that had given rise to their feelings and their concerns. So what had actually happened to trigger these circumstances? What was the context? And secondly, I would ensure that the minister or the senior counsellor concerned knew that I knew. So the normal route into this was to discuss the materiality of the question. So what was the issue in Falkirk last Friday? How can I help? What happened there? That kind of thing, which started the conversation and, of course, had the effect of conveying the fact that I knew perfectly well what had happened in that circumstance. And then, lastly, where required, and this wouldn't be on every occasion, to seek advice or maybe just to pass information to a senior counsellor or minister around these kind of issues. Why would you do that? Well, we're not dealing with a formal complaint here, so we're not dealing with any formal procedures if those existed in the jurisdictions. They didn't, I should say, in each of the other environments I worked in. So we're not dealing with the formalities of the situation, but the purpose of that was, yes, to seek advice, because the individual concerned, the minister, would be known and better known amongst his or her political colleagues than they would be amongst the civil service. And secondly, I felt it was important to make sure that the administration knew what we were dealing with. So this was part of keeping these issues front and centre, because I think the civil service is entitled to expect ministers to be able to control their behaviour. And where that had gone beyond reasonable bounds, but had not triggered a complaint, it didn't seem to me unreasonable that that should be a fact that was known about. And of course, if the individual, the minister concerned, had additional information about particular circumstances, then that was always important. So that's the kind of thing that one did in those circumstances. And the culture I'd grown up in local government and in Whitehall, was where formal procedures were not available, were not triggered by a known egregious act or other complaints. And this is how permanent secretaries plied their trade. The expectation was that where these situations occurred, and they wouldn't be particularly numerous or widespread, you'd be talking about a small number of individuals now and again, but they could be significant, and they were certainly significant in the lives of the people who'd been subjected to the behaviour, then you had a duty of care, to actually use the resources that were at your disposal to engage with the issue. Now, you might be asking, well, did it make a difference? Do these informal measures add up to anything? And my honest answer would be, in the short term, sometimes.
Thank you. You have partly anticipated some of my next question, which was, without talking about individuals, did you feel that lessons were being learned by the civil service during the time of your involvement about the kind of reasons why people do not raise complaints? You've mentioned some of those reasons just now, but were lessons being learned, were things being changed during this period to try to overcome some of these obstacles to people raising complaints of the kind you mentioned?
I hope so. Certainly we had and benefited from a strong relationship with all of our trade unions. And not only in a routine sense, I used to meet the trade unions once or twice a year on a round table basis. And always the most interesting part of the agenda was when the formal business had been finished and they wanted to share particular matters. There were also opportunities for trade union officials individually and collectively to talk to me. So we certainly knew, if ever we needed any knowledge, that the gross imbalance of power that I referred to would make it very likely that people would be very thoughtful about coming forward. What was also apparent, particularly at the top of the office, was that staff were deeply committed to their role, energised by being a civil servant at the top of the Scottish Government, proud of that. And one of the things that attracted me to come to Scotland was the long-standing traditions of pride, service and activity that well predate devolution that attended civil servants in Scotland. So here was evidence of that at the top of the office in my day, that people really believed in what they were doing and wanted to do it really well, and understood that they would be working under significant pressure. So you've got those two, an imbalance of power and the motivation of people to do the best they possibly could for ministers of whatever stripe. And that was an important issue. So this was not a partisan thing. This was being a civil servant and being a good one was what drove those people. So both those things would constrain an individual from wanting to push an issue. They'd be forgiving often. You know, they'd want to say, well, look, you know, life is very stressful at the top for a senior politician, etc. So yes, we were conscious of that. And to go back to your earlier question, the monthly conversation was part of the suite of measures. But I wonder if I could just help the committee a bit here, because I don't know what the arrangements are currently, but my physical proximity to the First Minister's private office, and I'm talking here not only about his private office proper, but the communications team, the special advisors, the events, all of those people. My physical proximity to these people was very close. So in St Andrew's House, they were literally across the corridor. And I made it my business to be in their open plan office often. So I would have conversations. I knew a good number of those people. And I had very regular, weekly conversations at least with the principal private secretary. And always we were talking about the arrangements, always and properly, the arrangement to support the First Minister and the Cabinet in the discharge of their duties. That's what I was essentially there for. A key part of my role was to get the civil service to work as effectively as it possibly could for ministers to fulfil their programme within the law. That was the job. So the principal private secretary and I talked all the time about how well we were doing that. Now, if you had bullying and intimidatory behaviour, here was a clear signal that something was not working for somebody, and indeed probably for both parties. So did we talk about that? Yes, we did. And we talked a lot about the measures that would ameliorate it, both for the individuals and indeed for the First Minister, to smooth things along, to work better. And again, just to give a sense of frequency here, for much of the time, that office, that operation, the whole show ran really well, with great energy and great motivation on both sides. So the normal diet was of pace, excitement, things happening, things being fixed, on we go. You're all familiar with how political environments work. They're very energizing places to be. But they were punctuated by these kind of behaviors that were a problem in the way that I've described. So there you've got, did I know about this? Yes, I did. And I listened to your proceedings earlier, where there was a question about the rumour mill. Well, I hadn't have to rely on the rumour mill. This was my daily working life. I was in touch with these people, alert to their concerns. And did we get more sensitive to them? Yes, we did. But again, we were working in an informal environment. We didn't have a formal complaint, somebody coming forward either individually or collectively to say, up with this, I will not put. You must do something. Nor did we have a known egregious act. I'm sorry about the vocabulary. What I'm talking about here is something that would strike anyone, regardless of what the complainant thought about it, as unacceptable behaviour. Now, in those circumstances, you've got something to get hold of. If you've got a complaint or a known egregious act, you've then got something that you can act upon. In the absence of those two conditions, I've tried to describe here the kind of things that I did.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I'm aware that time's moving on. We've now got a very good background of how Mr. Housen, sorry, Sir Peter, ran the show when he was Permanent Secretary. So we can move on, please, to Alex Cole-Hamilton, followed by Angela.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, Sir Peter. Thank you for coming to see us today. You said in line of questioning to Alistair Allen that the bullying behaviour would punctuate office life in St Andrew's House. So I take it, did you actually witness that bullying behaviour yourself on the part of Mr Salmond?
I can't go into specifics. You'll appreciate that.
I'm afraid I don't appreciate that. I mean, you're under oath here. I understand that you have a duty of care to protect the identities of people who might have been involved in this. So we're just asking you, for your recollection of the facts, did you witness Alex Salmond shouting at or bullying an individual member of staff?
I was well aware in the way that I've described that those behaviours took place. I had a number of conversations with people who'd been on the receiving end of that. And as I indicated, many conversations about what we could do to prevent their occurrence.
Did you witness it? Did it ever happen in your presence?
No.
Okay. You said also that, so this was widely known, you knew about the rumour mill because you actually knew the behaviours were happening. Were you aware of a sort of hum of concern about sexually inappropriate behaviour on the part of the First Minister?
There was no indication at any stage in my time in the Scottish Government, or indeed before, no suggestions of sexual misconduct.
Okay. Did Mr Salmond ever shout at you personally or act in a bullying or aggressive way to you?
No.
Okay. Did he shout, were you aware of him ever shouting at any of your Directors General?
No, I was not aware of him ever having shouted at any of my Directors General. Sorry, I'm trying to answer your question specifically.
That's fine. So just for the record and oath, I'm looking to clarify that Leslie Evans at no point, either formally or informally, raised concerns with you about the way she'd been treated by Mr Salmond.
I have no recollection of that occurring, no. But let me say that the senior group, I've talked about the private office, But the senior group of Director Generals and I, again, had the collective responsibility to get the civil service to work effectively for ministers. And these weren't regular conversations, but from time to time, an individual Director General might be having an issue with a minister, which could be on the boundaries of these kind of behaviours. And of course, we would talk about what was actually at stake here and all the other sort of ways. And again, these were not the stock in trade of day-by-day work, but they did occur, as they do in other working environments. And I've described the moral responsibility, the legal responsibility that as an employer, we had to attend to those circumstances in the best way we could.
Can I just go back to Margaret Mitchell's line of questioning? I mean, you said several times now that you had a way of handling these behaviours and making sure that they were smoothed over or they were dealt with to both satisfaction. The event in Falkirk, as you described it, what happened in Falkirk, if that became habituated, that if you felt that you weren't making progress and it was perhaps a particular member or members of staff that were on the receiving end of Mr. Salmon's temper, it would strike me that as we've established the appropriate procedure would be then for you to discuss it with the Deputy First Minister, but you keep hiding behind this defence of confidentiality to actually confirm to the committee whether you did actually ever discuss this with Nicola Sturgeon. I don't understand that tension. I mean, this is a matter of process. We're not asking you to identify complainers or individuals involved. We just want to know, did you apply that process that you've agreed to us would have been the appropriate way forward by raising these issues with Nicola Sturgeon at any point?
Can I intervene here? I think it's quite right that we talk about process, but we are not putting Mr. Salmond on trial at this committee. So could we be less specific about naming specific incidents and people and stick to the process?
Forgive me, Convener, but I don't believe I've named a specific incident. This is about a culture and the way things were dealt with. Sir Peter Housden has taken us through that. I'm not content, though, that this defence of confidentiality should prohibit him from just confirming the way things were done before the procedure was brought in. And that's what this committee is
that in itself is a different issue from speaking about specific incidents relating to one person who has already been on trial. And this committee is not about rerunning the trial. It's about looking at the culture of the organisation and the Scottish Government's response. So I just would ask you to veer away from being very specific about names.
Did you ever raise any concerns about any ministers with Nicola Sturgeon?
I have nothing further to add, Convener, to my previous answers in respect of this.
Okay, I have a final couple of questions, Convener. In terms of when you were handing over to Leslie Evans, did you ever discuss the management of conduct of ministers towards civil servants with her?
Just to refer back to what I just said, it was part of the conversation that went on in the senior group. It did not thereby need specific going over. My handover with Leslie Evans was focused upon issues that I was dealing with of the moment that she would be picking up the reins of. There was, for example, a live procurement issue of some depth and complexity, they always are. It was that
I get
kind
that,
of thing. Yeah.
Sir Peter, and thank you for that. But as we've established, there's always an informal side of the process as well, where the bodies are varied discussions that happen when anyone hands over to somebody else. And surely, given the extent to which you had to manage bullying behaviour by certain ministers, that would have been one of the most gritty aspects of your job, because it's one of the most sensitive ones. Surely you must have had conversations with Leslie Evans about how to deal with that.
Well, Leslie was part of that conversation over the time I was there in Scotland. She was a member of the senior group. But bear in mind again, we had no known egregious acts or formal complaints. So as far as we knew, and none of those, no indications of sexual misconduct. So as far as we knew, we had no bodies buried. So there was nothing that was in my secret box that I must pass on to the new a permanent secretary. So the general conversation Leslie was part of, we hadn't got formal complaints or known egregious acts.
And this ties nicely into my very final question, Convener. That reality may be down to the fact that not many people had confidence in the complaints procedure against such a powerful figure. So can I ask you, did any of the concerns raised with you in ad hominem terms, to use your phrase, did any of them go on to appear as formal complaints on the creation of the procedure in 2017-18?
I couldn't tell you. I have no access to that information or to the complainants. So I'm not able to help you.
Okay, thank you.
Angela Constance, please, and then Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Mr Housden. Mr Housden, you spoke in detail about the informal process around dealing with any concerns. And in your written submission to committee in paragraph 2.29, you said that where a formal complaint was brought against a minister, formal procedures would be followed. Can you just talk us through how such a formal procedure in your time as PermSec, how that would look?
Well, the formal procedure that existed in my period as permanent secretary was, of course, based on the Fairness at Work process. That itself is based, of course, on employment law and good practice advice. And had we had a formal complaint, that is what we, or indeed a known egregious act, that is what we would have followed. Okay.
The Scottish Government's written evidence states in paragraph 19 that its review of 2017 found that none of the policies in place allowed consideration of complaints against former ministers. So that's obviously a reference to policies in your time as permanent secretary. Can I ask, did you ever consider expanding policies to include former ministers?
No. There was no conversation about, in my recollection, about the width and the coverage of that policy. It was relatively recent. And of course, it predated by a good number of years the watershed of Me Too. So there was no consciousness in this organisation, or indeed in the civil service or more broadly, of the prevalence of the kind of behaviours that here and elsewhere have led to some very important safeguarding procedures being put in place. So no, those conversations were not part of the DAD.
Okay, and in paragraph 2.31 of your submission, you've already spoken today about that structural imbalance of power and asymmetry and accountability. But you've also acknowledged that ultimately ministers are accountable to Parliament. And I wonder if you can explain how a stronger external accountability for ministers via, as you suggest, through an independent parliamentary standards commissioner perhaps, how that could be implemented to complement and support ministerial accountability to Parliament.
I think that's a very important issue. It's also very technical, and I am, 5 years after the fact particularly, inexpert in how that would be articulated and what its relations would be to the existing policies. Because it seems to me quite clear that any independent element would not be a substitute for good HR policies on the ground, but would, if you like, stand as a guarantor and a place of last resort for a complainant to go to. I also think it would have a symbolic and material effect on the climate in which people were working. The fact that these things could take place, I think, would be important. But I wouldn't go any further in terms of specifying how that might be done, because, again, that would just go beyond my expertise. I was seeking, in making that response, to come back on the invitation the convener gave me, but that's very broad brush.
Okay, thank you for that. And my final question, convener, given your range of experience across public services in different settings, I wondered if you had a view about whether or not you think the separation of pastoral support for staff in event of a concern, that should be very separate from more investigative roles around specific complaints.
When you talk about pastoral support, could you just help me a little further?
Well, the committee's heard a fair amount of evidence of the government's attempts to provide support where staff have raised concerns informally. And I'm asking whether it's really important or not, in your view, that those processes around pastoral support around more informal concerns, that they are kept separate, or not, in your view, from more formal investigative processes?
My understanding would be that that is a principle of good HR practice, that an investigation is undertaken by somebody who is not involved on a day-to-day basis with the circumstances being investigated.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, convener.
Just before I move on to Jackie Bailey, Sir Peter, can I ask your opinion on something that I found quite interesting? We have heard that the Scottish Government decided to put into their policy about former ministers, that this was the first in the UK and that no other administration has followed that lead. And the trade unions were particularly strong on discussing that. And I just wondered what your opinion was about it.
Well, I've referred to Me Too. I think one of the most powerful pieces of learning for me and for, I guess, for many others was being to understand the kind of issues and pressures on women who've experienced sexual assaults that can, in many cases, defer or prevent them from coming forward to recount their experiences in a formal way, and the kind of triggers that enable them to do that. And it can be argued that a formal procedure is one of those safeguards that would make it more likely. But what you did see in Me Too, in a whole series of different environments, was a very considerable time delay in women coming forward. And in those circumstances, to enable those complaints to be made against former ministers seems to me to be quite right. And if you run the tape in the other direction to say, well, you can never make a complaint against a minister unless he or she is actually in post, that would seem highly restrictive. So yes, it seemed to me to be an important step in terms of recognising and protecting the circumstances of particularly women, and particularly those who've been subjected to sexual assault.
Thank you very much. Jackie Bailey, followed by Margaret Fraser.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Sir Peter. Fairness at work was obviously the policy that applied during your tenure as Permanent Secretary, and it still does for staff other than ministers and former ministers. Is there anything wrong with the Fairness at Work policy that you would change?
Well, 5 years after the fact, I wouldn't venture a view on that. I think serving officials would be much better placed to give you a view.
Okay, thank you. When you, in a similar vein to Angela Constance and the convener, when you were the Permanent Secretary, did you identify a gap or see a need for a policy that covered former ministers and indeed former civil servants?
No.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask, were you consulted by the current Permanent Secretary about the wisdom of introducing a retrospective harassment policy?
No.
Okay. And finally, let me encourage you to answer this one, because I'm not asking you to name people who reported concerns. I'm not asking you to even name the people who concerns were reported about, and I'm not asking about particular ministers, okay? I'm asking a process question that isn't prohibited by the Civil Service Code. You said to us in response to Alex Cole-Hamilton that when people raise concerns with you, you would seek or you would speak to senior ministers. Can you define for me what a senior minister is?
Let me just be doubly clear. That was not an invariable part of a procedure that I followed. It was where appropriate, I would do that.
But you have done it.
But I have done it.
Yes. So I'm seeking to understand, what is a senior minister? It's not by dint of somebody's age or longevity, in office. It is clearly you are referring to a type of minister. And I'm assuming that's not the entirety of the shadow cabinet. So I'm seeking to understand your own words, Sir Peter.
Well, I think the adjective I used was senior. So
You did.
It would be a senior minister and somebody with whom I felt such a conversation would be profitable.
Okay, forgive me for being a bit pedantic, but I think you would agree with me, senior isn't longevity in ministerial office,
No.
Senior isn't somebody's age, senior is by definition of the post they hold. So when you're talking about senior ministers, who are you meaning?
Well, longevity and is often an experience is often a factor around all of that. But I'm not going to play a part in the jigsaw identification of ministers.
Oh, okay. I think jigsaw identification applies to people who are complainants. I am simply interested in a process question about who you would alert. So I will make an assumption that senior ministers, in my book, are the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister. Would that be an unwise assumption to make?
I have no further comment to make on those questions.
Thank you very much, Sir Peter.
Yeah, I just wonder on that point. I don't think that you were referring to, in the last point there, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, it was, Jackie, your thought there. I thought you should have intervened, Convener, to explain that we weren't talking about...
No, I think Miss Bailey's quite content with her response.
We weren't talking about complainants. We were talking about
No,
senior ministers. And
Miss
the jigsaw,
Miss Mitchell,
the
please.
jigsaw identification
Yeah.
refers to complainants.
Yes,
Can I-
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think Sir Peter is clever enough to understand exactly what he said to me and the nature of my question, and he had no further comment to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Bailey. Murdo Fraser, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Sir Peter. Some of the ground I was going to cover has already been gone over by Alistair Allen, so I've just got a few short questions if I can. And can I just go back to your written submission, where you talk about how informal resolution was generally considered by all parties to be the most appropriate and effective solution. And you go on to say, where there were individual ministers whose behaviour was a cause for concern, the expectation was that the Permanent Secretary would manage these situations without recourse to formal procedures. Confidentiality requirements preclude me from sharing the particulars, my experience, but I took actions on these lines in a number of settings. Now, I mean, a number could be 1 or it could be 100, so I wonder if you can give us a flavour of what the scale of these issues were when you were Permanent Secretary and how many occasions you had to take action.
Thank you. When I refer to settings there in paragraph 228, I'm talking about the different jurisdictions in which I've worked. So these kind of issues arose in each circumstance. And I should also say that the vocabulary here is just not helpful, because those of you who have been involved in cases involving mediation, for example, will understand the proper sense of the word resolution, where you bring people together and seek to effect some kind of understanding and resolution that enables them to carry on working together. Now, I'm not using it in that strict formal sense. I'm talking about things that you would do to, in the way that I've described, to move a situation forward. So how frequent were these? Well, the number of ministers who were involved in my time in public service, which was a long period, would be almost single figures, and the recurrence, the persistence of the issues, of course, varied between that very small sample of ministers, but they could be part of the everyday life of engaging with a particular minister. But again, just to re-emphasize that they were part of the universe of working with that minister. They did not define what working life was like, but that there was always that possibility in the background. So that's the kind of circumstance I'm talking about.
Okay, I mean, thank you for that clarity. Clearly, this committee is interested in your time as Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government. So could you put a number on how many cases you're talking about in that context?
Well, I dealt with a number in local government and in Whitehall. So not many would be the answer in relation to Scotland.
Fewer than 10?
Oh, certainly, yes, because in the totality of my time in public service, the number would be fewer than 10.
Okay, thank you. We heard in previous sessions from the trade unions about how if concerns were raised by staff, often the resolution would be that that individual who'd raised a concern would be moved to another department. Is that something that you encountered personally or you facilitated as Permanent Secretary?
It would not be the kind of thing that I would have facilitated as Permanent Secretary. There were many reasons why a member of staff might move from a private office type of environment. Some of them were not as a result of egregious behaviour, but just somehow a failure to click. So the minister and the individual just, you know, there are all sorts of vocabulary for all this, but it was just a mutual agreement that it would be best for that individual to come away. Now, I was aware that those kind of things would happen, one. Two, those of you with that experience will understand perfectly well that it's a very high-pressure environment for the minister and for the staff working for he or she. So again, the attrition rate was relatively high. People would do it for a time and then move on. But to be specific, I was never involved in a circumstance, I presume on your question here, in a circumstance where we had a sense that an individual had been badly treated in behavioural terms and it would be necessary to move them out of that environment.
Okay, thank you. And we've heard from other witnesses about how informal arrangements could sometimes be made to complement formal procedures. So without going into specific cases, are you aware of any changes in working practices that were made in relation to ministerial offices as a result of concerns that were expressed by staff?
The context here is of the conversations I had all the time with the Principal Private Secretary about getting the machine to work effectively for ministers. So all the time we talked about arrangements, about fine-tuning, about what he or she, the Principal Private Secretary, was doing in the environment to get things to work. And this would rarely, very rarely, be about behavioural issues per se, much more normally about the shifting current of government business. So what would help the First Minister? I can remember, for example, as renewable energy became a bigger and bigger issue, actually reinforcing the staff who had that kind of expertise in his own office to help with those circumstances. So those kind of issues would be the things that we would talk about, yes.
And was there ever an example of a concern about a behavioural issue on the part of the minister that led to a change in working practices?
No, not one that was put to me in those terms, certainly.
Okay, and one last question if I can, Convener. You were talking earlier about bullying and intimidatory behaviour. In your experience, was that ever directed particularly towards women rather than men, or was there no difference?
just to re-emphasise, throughout my time, there were no indications in relation to any minister of sexual misconduct. I, secondly, did not identify any differentiation in terms of whether women or men were more likely to be the subject of that kind of behaviour.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Maureen Watt and then Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Sir Peter. You have said there were no formal complaints against ministers under your time in office as Permanent Secretary. Would you, however, say that there was behaviours and actions taken to avoid formal complaint?
Could you just help me a little further?
By
whom?
anyone, by anybody involved in the kind of high-pressured situation?
I'm certainly not aware of anyone seeking to avoid such a complaint being made. No. Could you help me a little bit more?
Well, were there, for example, any involvement of the trade unions in any of your time who came forward with any complaints about any ministers?
As I've mentioned before, there were conversations from time to time with senior union officials about the circumstances in the First Minister's office. At no stage did those crystallise into a complaint, either an individual complaint or a collective class action type of issue around. I think I shouldn't speak for them. They've given evidence to you, but the culture in which we were operating was very much one of informal handling of these situations.
And at any time, did you have to make any minister or cabinet secretary aware of the fairness at work policy and how staff should be treated?
Not specifically in relation to fairness at work, but I did indicate that in relation to my collective work with ministers in the cabinet and individually, would often talk about the overall position in the civil service, talk in some detail actually about the staff survey and what it said and what we could draw from it in terms of understanding where the organisation was. And of course with individual ministers as they went about their business, all the time they would be talking to me about the officials that were working to them, about how effective they were, about ways in which we could supplement, augment, improve the situation around. And we would often talk about people's experience, motivation, the circumstances in which they did well and less well. So yes, those conversations were around. And I always tried really to be sympathetic. Ministers didn't raise questions with you because they were trivial. They clearly mattered to the minister concerned. But to emphasise the importance of actually how hard staff worked on their behalf and the importance of morale and motivation. So it was that kind of intervention that would be typical of the conversations I'm describing.
Thank you. And did you ever have to remind ministers of the ministerial code that they'd signed and the behaviours required under the ministerial code?
No, and that really wouldn't be necessary or part of, well, you'd be an awful long way down the track and the conversation would not be going very well if you got to that kind of circumstance. Ministers were perfectly aware of the terms under which they are appointed and of the overall climate. So no, you don't get into those kind of conversations.
But the ministerial code has since been revised since your time. Do you think, well, I'm assuming that perhaps you've looked at both the fairness and work policy and the ministerial code currently. Do you think that they reflect the current situation in terms of working relationships, if you like, in government and civil service?
I'm afraid I'd be
Satisfactory.
ill-qualified to offer a view on that 5 years and counting away, so current officials would have a better view around those questions.
But you said in response to a question from Angela Constance that you thought that involving the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner might be a good idea. Do you still believe that to be the case?
Well, I'd seen, for example, in the procedure used for complaints against the First Minister, the use of independent advisors on those questions. And of course, in the years since I've been away, in Westminster and beyond, we've seen independent commissioners of different kinds being appointed and going about their work. So it seems to me as a general proposition, that has some interesting things to commend it. But to go back to Ms. Constance's point, then I think there are some important technical governance questions on which I would be particularly unsuited after this distance to offer advice, and I'm sure there are people who could help the committee on that better than I could.
Just finally, Convener, in all of this, there have been a lot of people involved who have not had specific HR experience. Do you think that's a failure? And for example, if an independent person was to come in, don't you think they would have to be very au fait with things like fairness at work, current employment law and things like that?
You're talking here about an independent.
Well, independent, but also within the civil service, we've heard that a number of people have held senior posts and do not have HR qualifications. You wouldn't put someone without a legal background in a position where they were advising on the law. It seems to me that the civil service generally has been lacking in requiring HR professionals in post.
Well, let me take the two parts of your question then. I think in terms of an independent commissioner, more important than the precise focus of their experience and background is their standing. So they need to be people of self-evident high integrity who would command respect amongst here MSPs and the wider community, point one. Point two, you'd need to make very sure, your point, that they had access to the highest quality of legal and HR advice. And in my submission too, I think they would also understand what it is like to work in a democratically accountable environment, as you do, and similarly what large complicated organisations are like. So I think you could work a person specification up on those lines and get some really powerful people coming forward to do that kind of thing. I think that there's a different set of considerations in terms of staff within the body of the Scottish Government. HR, as you know from your experience, of course, is a very wide church. It covers things like leadership development all the way through to the formalities of grievance and discipline procedures, be what that may. So I think you need a variety of skills being brought to bear, and you need the judgment amongst the senior group about how to deploy those skills in particular circumstances, when to call in external advice. Of course, to draw the legal parallel, the legal service here will draw in external legal advice where they're on specialist territory. And similarly, in relation to HR, you might choose to do that, or you might choose to have somebody independent who is not from a part of your own civil service. So I think you've got a range of considerations there, and you need to make sure that in any particular circumstance you had people charged with the responsibility who were capable of discharging it. Final point, qualifications can be important there, but they are no determinant. We've all worked with people who've got a lot of qualifications but lack judgment and experience. So you want a mixture, really, and you need to be sure that in those circumstances they've got an appropriate balance and that they're well supported, because we all reach the end of our technical competence. We all need somebody to actually run propositions past, to say, I'm seeing this way, do you agree? So I think it's quite a rich canvas about thinking about how you reach a view about the fitness for purpose of an individual in a particular circumstance.
Thank you.
Alison Johnson.
Morning. I'd like to begin by asking, you make a point at 2.17. I appreciate this is a recollection, but you recollect that there wasn't thought to be a systemic problem of underreporting in relation to bullying and harassment. I'd just like to understand what informs that view.
Thank you. The metric we had principally, of course, here was that in the staff survey. And I think you've already had evidence on just what a undefined and difficult category that is. It's a pretty blunt instrument to try and understand what's going on in an organisation, because you're dealing there with a very wide variety of behaviours, exhibited by a very wide variety of individuals, you know, from members of the public all the way through to elected politicians, and you are resting on individual perceptions, i.e. the individual concerned regarded that as bullying and harassment. So it is quite a mixture of things. And so what did we do? Well, you listen very carefully to your staff and to the trade unions about all of this. And my presumption, our presumption always, was that one genuine case of bullying and harassment was one too many. And that we were very mindful that a lot of these cases where they occurred were rooted in managers who were out of their depth, who didn't know how to lead staff effectively and respond to concerns in an appropriate way. So we did a lot of work on training and development and on selection to make sure that the overall level of competence amongst our leaders and managers rose. And we had some evidence that that was working. So we would look at those kind of circumstances, talk to the trade unions. But when I looked, last point, when I looked at the comparative levels of bullying and harassment reporting across this very, very wide civil service survey that was published every year, our figures didn't stand out. They were better than some, higher than you would have wanted, of course, but considerably better than some organisations. So they didn't say to me there is an endemic problem around underreporting.
Okay, thank you. You've, in responding to colleagues, you've noted that, you know, you've spoken of informal means to address areas of concern, and you know, reflecting on whether these means were effective, you've said in the short term, sometimes. And in your written submission, you say, and I think you mentioned this to Murdo Fraser too, in considering our general approach, informal resolution was generally considered by all parties to be the most appropriate and effective solution. I mean, that speaks to me of a culture in which perhaps there's an element there of reluctance to take that next step. And I'd just like to hear your opinion. You know, is it your view that there was enough support to take concerns further when that was clearly warranted?
No, I think you make an entirely fair point. So we're talking here about the period 2010 to 2015. I think the prevailing culture here in the Scottish Government and in other environments where I had worked and knew of at the time, that was the presumption. That I think I said in my evidence that it fell to the permanent secretary to use informal mechanisms to move those situations forward in the best way that he or she had. So you're quite right. So I say that's a cultural thing. That was the expectation that was on a permanent secretary when he or she took up post, and that's what happened. And I think that the work of this committee, I'm sure, will contribute a further step. I think that what's happened, particularly since 2017, has taken us on a very important journey, actually, into an environment in which particularly women feel better supported in the everyday course of their work, and where necessary, know that there are formal procedures that they have seen working, hopefully, and have confidence in, and that have some kind of guarantee of integrity that would enable them to reach a decision. And I think that's the important thing. At the end of the day, it will be a decision for the individual employee to make, and it's a big one, as I'm sure your evidence will have brought to the table if it needed any underlining. It's a very significant thing to do. But the important thing is that you're creating the conditions where people can take those decisions soundly.
In your written submission, you note that culture will remain the critical factor, however. So perhaps we need to move away from a culture where there's almost a determination to have that informal process rather than a more formal process. And you note too that the climate now is much more sensitive to these issues, and rightly so. But you do say the key, however, will be political will. So it is, you know, I think you've just alluded to it there, where political will might be lacking for a variety of reasons, there is a need for a very clear pathway for complainants.
Yes.
Can you just outline any efforts that were made during your tenure as Permanent Secretary to ensure that such a pathway existed?
As I've indicated, the perception that we needed a more robust formal process to enable members of staff to have confidence the way I've been described was not there in my years. So the cultural expectation, as you rightly identify, was that these cases would be moved forward as best they could be informally. But can I just say a word about informal? Because, as you understand perfectly well, but just for the record, the employment law and good practice advice makes it very clear that in any circumstance where you've got a conflict, a problem to resolve, you start, small I, informally. So it's not a good thing that people leap immediately to procedures. You need, you know, of course, the opportunity to understand and to see just how serious this is and where we're going. Your point, I think, is that that needs to be underpinned by a clear pathway in which people have got confidence that if they do want to take an issue forward, they can do so. And I'm just identifying strongly with that as a proposition. I think that would be a big step forward, but it was not the culture, it was not the environment that pertained in the years up to 2017, certainly in my time as a Permanent Secretary.
Thank you. I have two more questions, Convener. You note at 2:15 in your written submission that firm and sensible line management would sometimes be interpreted as bullying and harassment. So we have this issue, the impact of behaviour that isn't clearly defined. How do we prevent this? How do we better inform understandings of what constitutes bullying and harassment, or will there always be an element of the perception of the individual in this?
Good question. I think to start at where you concluded, there will always be an element of perception, clearly. I think it's the job of the organisation to make sure that the individuals concerned, everyone in the organisation, has access to a really good manager who's empathetic, clear, supportive in all of those ways. And I know in my time, I'm sure beyond, work to train line managers at all levels in those skills was intense. We also, and here again the staff survey was extraordinarily helpful, we also could target places in the organisation where the evidence suggested this was an issue. So the broad staff engagement score could be broken down to quite a level of granularity in terms of divisions and directorates. So you could identify areas where there was an issue and see what was, open that box, see what was actually happening in those circumstances and take steps to improve it. That was enormously helpful. So it wasn't just a scattergun. You could see that actually the problem was here or the problem was there. And if, just to be clear that this was an important issue for us, I can distinctly remember a conversation with the Director General it was about setting objectives for the year ahead, where I exemplified the staff engagement score in a particularly important division of responsibility for that individual. And we set that as a priority for them to tackle the underlying issues. So it was a serious issue for us about management capability, basically. But at the bottom, this will always depend upon perceptions, because I know, you will know, of circumstances where highly capable managers have moved into a more formal environment with a member of staff who is struggling to deliver what is expected of them. And in some environments, you can find that very quickly is followed by a grievance alleging bullying and harassment. So one person's bullying and harassment is another person's firm line management. And in the way I've described, I'm just hoping that the quality of the management was good enough, both to reduce the number of people who felt that way and to help us move forward in situations where they didn't, but perceptions would always be perceptions.
And finally, you suggest a number of preventative measures that could be considered, and we've discussed some of them during this session, but you speak about enhanced ministerial induction and on-the-job training. You know, Maureen Watt, you know, raised the question, did you have to make ministers aware of how staff should be treated? But could there be more done in that regard?
Well, again, I'm sorry to be so far away now, but you'll know much better than I about the arrangements obtained within your own party and indeed within the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government as a whole. But in my time, bearing in mind this finished 5 years ago, it was quite rare. Ministerial training tended to happen infrequently and typically at relatively junior levels in Whitehall. It would be not difficult to get people to agree that somebody else needed training, and those arrangements would be made. So in my day, and I'm speaking only of that, those arrangements could have been improved. And in my experience in local government, we found that actually what helped was not ministers being required to listen to experts, but to enable politicians to talk to each other about the circumstances they dealt with. So peer-to-peer learning in the jargon, where a minister would describe his or her experience with other colleagues and say the things they found difficult, the things they found worked, create an environment where people felt able to admit things that had not worked, that they'd not got right. That's how people learn. So a rich environment that you, I'd venture, as elected members, feel in charge of. So this is your product rather than something you're being required to do, seems to me most likely to help in this environment. But last point, at the end of the day, people will watch very carefully what the most senior people do, won't they? And that's what I mean about example. So you can have all of this apparatus, but they will watch what people do. So that too is a very important component.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes our questioning.
Convener, sorry.
Well, we don't have points of order at committees, but
Right.
I'm quite happy to let you say something if you'd like to say it. Mr.
So I just wanted to state for the record, you mentioned in an earlier line of questioning that I was in danger of putting Alex Salmond on trial. That was not my intention. I hope it's become obvious to everyone by now that the line of questioning I'm seeking to establish, if there was sufficient concerns about Mr. Salmond in the upper echelons of the civil service, that characterised the design of this new procedure. And if that was done specifically to fit the concerns around Mr. Salmond, then I think that's important for us to know. So in order to establish that, I've pursued a line of questioning which asks about the concerns that were held about Mr. Salmond at the time.
Okay. I think that's now on the official record and all noted. And that leads me to something else I would like to place on the official record, which I think is appropriate. And I would refer everyone to a letter from Mr. James Hind, who came and gave us evidence fairly recently. His letter has now been published on the committee's webpage, but on record here, I'd like to state that Mr. Hind is concerned that some of the evidence he gave was later misrepresented, and he has asked that a particular point be put on record here, which is that he is clear that he was not aware of any rumours about sexually inappropriate behaviour on the part of Mr Salmond or other ministers. So can I now thank Sir Peter Howson for his evidence. Thank you for submission of your written evidence, Sir Peter, and for coming to speak to the committee all in a voluntary capacity. Thank you. And we will now have a short break to allow for the changeover of witnesses. Convene. And can I welcome Barbara Allison, former Director of People at the Scottish Government from 2009 to 2016. Miss Allison remains a civil servant as Director of Communications and Ministerial Support. Can I begin, please, by inviting Miss Allison to take the oath? If you would raise your right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. May I invite you, Miss Allison, to give an opening statement explaining your job role and work on policies preceding the complaints procedure.
Thank you, Convener. Convener, this opening statement aims to give some context about my current role as Director of Communications, Ministerial Support and Facilities, and in my previous role as Director of People with regard to the matters that relate to the committee's remit. I've worked with the Scottish Government since 2008, following 14 years with the Scottish Prison Service, latterly as Director of HR there for 5.5 years. I was asked to join SG as Head of HR in January 2008 and was subsequently promoted to Director of HR and Corporate Services in 2009. Since June 2016, I've been Director of Communications, Ministerial Support and Facilities. I thought it would be helpful if I summarise what my involvement has been in matters which have interested the committee to date. I was in charge of HR when the Fairness at Work policy was developed and introduced in 2010. Members of the HR policy team led in the development with regular dialogue with the trade unions. So whilst the team led in the detailed development of the policy, I was aware of the general direction of the work and would have been at the key meetings. I was not directly involved in the development of the policy on the handling of harassment complaints involving current or former ministers. However, I was the individual asked through that period to take on the role to provide pastoral care to staff if required. To be clear, that role is different from the role of the confidential sounding board, which has been discussed at the committee previously. I had some early contact with the two individuals who ultimately became complainants under the policy for handling of harassment complaints. Other than this early initial contact, I had no involvement in the investigation. Finally, as has been set out by others in previous weeks, I'm giving evidence to the committee on behalf of ministers and not in a personal capacity. Convener, as the committee appreciates, this is complex legal territory, and as I have explained, I am privy to certain information that was subject of legal proceedings and the confidentiality of which is now protected. I ask the committee's patience. I am cautious in answering questions in certain matters, or if I have to stop and seek advice or follow-up questions in writing with detail to ensure accuracy and to ensure that all the government's legal duties are fulfilled. In line with the approach of other attendees, I would wish to declare that I am a member of the FDA union. Thank you, Convener.
We'll move straight to questions. And first of all, our Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Ms Allison. When you were Head of HR, as some people have been kept referring to, also known as Director of People from 2009 to 2016, were any harassment concerns or informal harassment complaints against ministers, including the former First Minister, raised with you under the new 2010 Fairness at Work policy in the period from 2010 to 2014?
So I was aware of not specific complaints, but I was aware of issues that had been raised through the trade unions. But I wasn't aware of any specific complaints.
Okay, thank you. Under the Fairness at Work policy, if a complaint passed to you as Head of HR or Director of People could not be resolved informally and was put in writing, then it had to be passed to the Permanent Secretary or the Deputy First Minister. Were any complaints put in writing? In that case, did you escalate any of these harassment concerns or informal complaints to the Permanent Secretary, Peter Housden, or the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon?
No.
No, okay. Did you ever discuss or use any other form of communication to informally make the Deputy First Minister aware of any harassment complaints or any harassment concerns or informal complaints in this period of 2010 to 2014, because we know from St Peter's evidence there was a prevailing culture of bullying behaviour and a level of concern about the instances or that culture as it prevailed.
So perhaps it'd be helpful if I was absolutely clear. I was not aware of any issues about sexual harassment. I would just quite like to be clear about that. So, so just for clarity, but I did not raise any issues about bullying harassment with either the Permanent Secretary or the Deputy First Minister.
Okay, thank you.
Hamilton.
Thank you. Convener, so thank you very much for coming to see us today, Barbara Allison. Ms Allison, Sir Peter Howson revealed to us that office life in the very inner sanctum around Alex Salmond was often punctuated by incidents of bullying behaviour, that was his word, by Mr Salmond, and he would seek to handle those issues on an informal basis. Did he ever discuss his approach to these problems with you as Director of People? Okay. Do you recall a time when he raised those behaviours directly with the Deputy First Minister, or were you aware of that? Okay. Were you aware of an organisational scuttlebutt around concerns of Mr Salmond's behaviour, firstly in terms of bullying behaviour?
So I was aware that Mr Salmond could be demanding and could be difficult to work for. He expected high standards, and if he didn't get that, then you know, he would express his displeasure. I would like to say, for fairness, that people also expressed that they enjoyed working for him. He was visionary, he was dynamic, it was a bit of a roller coaster. So, you know, I think there was lots of shades of grey. So there were rumours of, as I said, him being demanding and difficult, but I think, you know, people had different experiences of working with him.
And so you never, just for clarity, you never heard any kind of rumour around sexual misconduct on the part of him?
Absolutely
okay.
not.
That's fine. Just moving on to the your role as a pastoral care officer for the complainers, and I'm glad to hear there was such a post put in to help them. You said you had early contact with people that would go on to make complaints under the new procedure. When did you first learn about their allegations in terms of, was it during your role as Director of People, or was it much, much later when the procedure was instituted and they raised those complaints?
So I will watch with the convener here and just make sure that she intervenes if she feels. I was aware of nothing at all about any allegations about sexual harassment until 2017.
Okay, so that's when you first learned. And then finally, I'll take a break after the next question to let other people in, but I do have a few follow-ups. So do you, just for clarity, are you as the sort of chalk face role in terms of the day-to-day management of people in the organisation, were you ever aware of informal circumstances where people were moved around or working practices changed because of friction with Mr Salmond?
So at the time, no, I wasn't. I have subsequently become aware that arrangements were put in place, but I was not aware at the time. I think, having said that, I think moving people is quite an appropriate way to deal with issues if people aren't, you know, getting on. Sir Peter mentioned, I think, well, I would call it chemistry. So I think, particularly in private offices, I think it's very important that there's good chemistry between ministers and their private office, and that, you know, that they gel well. So, you know, if either in private office or another area it was appropriate to move somebody on an informal basis, I think that's perfectly appropriate.
Okay, that's it for now. Thanks.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning still. Can I ask, you've highlighted your own early involvement with the complainants, and I would just like to ask, you know, we've heard in earlier sessions that complainant was party to an early sight of a draft procedure. So when you were in post as Director of People, would sharing draft HR policies with individuals be typical?
I mean, we certainly would engage widely with trade unions, obviously, with networks, So we have a lot of staff networks around LGBTI, race, disability, etc. So we would share drafts with them. I'm not aware of sharing it with any particular individuals, but certainly we'd want to make sure that, you know, we were taking views of staff widely.
To share it with a specific individual? Would there be a reason why an individual was chosen apart from the areas you've highlighted?
I mean, I am aware of, or my understanding of why it was shared in this case was, had this policy been in place, this procedure been in place at the time, would this have helped in terms of raising an issue? You know, I think that, you know, so in terms of would this have made a difference? So that's my understanding of why it was shared on this occasion.
Okay, you've said that you were aware of issues being raised, but that no formal complaints were made. So do you have any concerns that staff were reluctant to take that next step? In our earlier session this morning with Mr. Housden, you know, he made the point, which is quite reasonable, that you wouldn't always want to go to, you know, to take that step where unnecessary. But there seems to be a culture of, you know, great focus on informal means of addressing issues, for example, moving staff. Mm-hmm. Do you feel there was enough support for staff who felt that they may want to go further?
I mean, our statistics for the formal complaints raised are low. And that may lead you to believe then that people were reluctant to do that. I'm a great believer in informal resolution, and I don't think that's, I suppose, I'm concerned slightly that it feels like it's an easy option. Or, I mean, I think if you can get in early and resolve an issue between two individuals, nip it in the bud, you know, clarify it's often lack of communication or a misunderstanding, then I think and the Fairness at Work policy supports that. So the individual contact with the line manager to see if they can resolve it, informal contact with HR, and if they can't, then you can go on a formal basis. So I am a trained mediator, and I'm part of the mediation network that we use. And I am a huge advocate for the informal resolution. However, if it can't be resolved, then absolutely people must have recourse to a formal process.
And what's your view on the, excuse me, the evidence of trade union representatives who suggested that it was often the individual who raised the complaint who was moved, and that while perhaps managing an immediate concern, this approach failed to address, you know, wider issues within the organisation?
I mean, I think I listened with great interest, as you'd imagine, to the trade unions' evidence. And to be honest, I think when I was in HR or as line manager generally, you know, I think it can be frustrating if there are issues that come to, or that people don't raise issues. But I think people very often want to go to the unions or come to a line manager to air things and don't necessarily want action taken. They want somebody to hear and to share an experience with. I mean, as I said to Mr. Cole-Hamilton, I mean, I think if there is an issue, the best thing is to resolve it. An answer may be to move people. I don't think that's necessarily a bad option. You know, I think it's been portrayed, as I said, that it's wrong. Sometimes that is, you know, if people aren't getting on, you move somebody. It's a very large organisation we work for. It's over 7,000 people. There's lots of opportunities. It doesn't mean to say that it's detrimental to somebody's career to be moved.
What are your views on the efficacy of a process that doesn't have an independent element? And I think Mr. Penman from the FDA, I think, was quite clear that the lack of that independent investigator has had, well, we understand the impact in our current work, but what are your views on the lack of that independent investigator?
I think if it's an employment contract, you know, I think there's an employment tribunal externally somebody can go to. I mean, I think there are a number of ways where people can have their issue raised and looked at out with the line independently, still within the organisation. I mean, I think we will obviously, you know, look at in the fullness of time with the Lord and Lot review and there's some committee's considerations, whether we need more independence. But I think, when you're dealing with an employment situation, I think, there's informal, formal, and there's appeal mechanisms, and there's external appeal mechanisms. So I would hope that there's sufficient, impartiality within the organisation to ensure that people feel that they're dealt with on an impartial basis.
And did you feel during your time as Director of People that the Fairness at Work policy, its operation, did you feel that it was fit for purpose, or was it clear to you that it had to be improved?
So when we introduced it in 2010, it was we took the Dignity at Work policy, which had come in 2003 and was updated in 2005, 2007. So there was a number of steps brought in 2010 with that. It clarified unacceptable behaviour, the roles of the line manager, the roles of countersigning manager. It really emphasised the importance of mediation, etc. I think it's right. People Directorate were looking to review fairness at work in 2017, so I think it's right that policies are reviewed over time to ensure that they're still fit for purpose. I think that with policies, I think timescales are an issue. I think how long it takes to resolve things, so I think that's an issue. But I think the Fairness at Work policy in and of itself provides mechanisms to resolve issues. I think it is fit for purpose. I think like any, it should be reviewed at a point in time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Angela Constance has some questions around the same theme as raised.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Miss Allison. Given your experience as a previous Director of People over several years, 2009 to 2016, I wondered if you had a view about the evidence we've heard from Peter Housden and his suggestion of an external independent process in terms of dealing with complaints against ministers, such as a Parliamentary Standards Commissioner. Now, he did say that this would not be a substitute for good HR practice and that there were details in and around governance, issues about accountability of ministers to Parliament and such like. But he felt that there could be, a significant merit. It could have a material effect, could be a guarantor and a place of last resort. And I just wondered, Miss Allison, what your views would be of an external independent process, and actually how could that be made to work to good effect?
I think, as Sir Peter said, I think the issue about governance around how such a process would work with the ministerial code, etc., would be really important. And I know that some of the work that the People Directorate are looking at and had started was to look at how our current policies work with the ministerial code. So I think it's really understanding how these various processes would dovetail into one another. I think that would be quite important. I don't know, Miss Constance, obviously having been a minister yourself, I think that the relationship between civil servants and ministers is really important, and there's a lot of trust there, and I think if there's bringing in an independent person into that, would that change the relationship? I don't know. I certainly think it's something we would need to think quite carefully about, and whether there'd be unintended consequences if that was done.
And what about if it was a more tiered approach? Because both you and Peter Housden have spoke about informal processes and the value of that, and then, there are, more formalised processes, and, obviously there is indeed the ministerial code, but, is there a place, for somewhere along the line, in some circumstances, for the benefit of an external independent person?
There may well be. I think as you've rightly said, there are a number of processes already in place in terms of informal and formal, and maybe ultimately there's an independent. But I think in the fullness of time, we'll be able to consider these things.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Maureen Watt and then Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Miss Allison. Sir Peter talked about meeting once or twice a year with the trade unions formally. Were you involved in those, but did you also have more informal interactions yourself with the trade unions?
So yes, there'd be a twice yearly sort of partnership board where senior officials would meet the trade union officials. But we would routinely have, regular meetings with the trade unions on a sort of formal basis, and we would also have reasonably regular informal, you have good productive relationships, so if there were issues that we're aware of, they're not usually shy of picking up the phone and making you aware of things.
So were you contacted by trade unions about specific complaints against ministers? Never.
No, not specific, no.
So in HR, there's always, you never know whether an individual will go to the line manager first. The line manager may be, in fact, the person that they've got some problems with. So can you recall any situations where you were contacted directly by anyone in the civil service in relation to their interaction with ministers?
Not in my role as Director of People. More recently in my role in terms of Director of my long title, Communications, Ministerial Support and Facilities. So more recently, I have been contacted by people who would want to discuss with me their interactions with ministers.
But that's post the former First Minister being in post?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And in terms of the fairness at work policy being revised and the ministerial code being revised as well, do you think that as an HR person they are currently fit for purpose, or is there more revision required?
I think, as I said to Ms Johnson, I think fairness at work has been in place since 2010, slightly outdated to take account of the new procedure. I think it's absolutely right that it should be reviewed, and it had been started in 2017 by People Directorate, and I know they had done a lot of work in terms of what that might look like, but it has been halted at the moment. So, I think it's perfectly appropriate that it is reviewed in due course.
And in terms of policies being retrospective insofar as it can cover former complaints, is that something that's now standard in organisations or not?
I think certainly, I think as Sir Peter said, I think since 2017, I think people will be reviewing their policies to ensure that if staff want to raise complaints or issues, that they're able to do so, and there's nothing within a policy that would stop them doing that. I think it's really important.
Okay, thank you. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mrs. Allison. Now, I'm not interested in talking about individuals, so let me make that clear at the start, and I'm happy to take short and direct answers. Can I ask you, were you involved in the Edinburgh Airport press inquiry, and can you recall what date was that and what was your role?
So I'm aware of staff being approached about the Edinburgh Airport incident. So I'm not trying to be difficult. So I'm aware at the start of November 2017, we were conscious that there was a potential press inquiry about Edinburgh Airport.
Can you remember what day in November that was? If I said the 6th, was that
6th, that
the
was what I was
6th of
going to say,
November?
6th,
okay.
Yeah.
What was your role in that? You became aware. What was your role?
My role was that 2 members of staff contacted me to let me know that they had been contacted about a potential press inquiry.
Okay, thank you. I understand you were appointed to a special role by the current Permanent Secretary. Could you tell me what that role was and when you were appointed?
This is the pastoral care role. So I got a letter from the Permanent Secretary on the 11th of November 2017, and the purpose of that was twofold. One, that a number of people had been contacted by the press, and she was keen that they were given appropriate support if required. And the second thing was we were conscious that there had been, as a result of the staff messages that the Permanent Secretary issued, that there had been some people coming forward. And because of my responsibilities at the time, that it was likely that people from the current private office or comms might be people that would come forward. So she asked me if I would just add some support, point them towards, support mechanisms available, any issues, make HR aware.
So between the 6th and the 11th, you must have alerted to the Permanent Secretary to the fact that staff members had approached you about Edinburgh Airport. Can you recall when that was?
I don't think I made the Permanent Secretary aware of the Edinburgh Airport. I think somebody else did, of the Edinburgh Airport issue. So I don't think it's
so
me.
you have no recollection of telling her. Did you tell somebody else to tell her?
I think she was contacted by somebody else, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I move us on to just touch on the judicial review and the commission of documents in December 2018? Did you appear before that commission?
I did.
You did. Could you ask me, could I ask you even, whether documents or text messages or anything that you were involved in that you had to speak to the commission about?
Yes, I spoke about particularly text messages and whether I had any documentation.
Okay, could you tell us what the text messages showed?
I'm just checking with the convener. It isn't so. It's in connection with my early contact with one of the people who ultimately became a complainant. So there was text correspondence between us at the time.
Okay. Did you text the Permanent Secretary at all?
No.
To warn her about a potential complaint coming in?
I didn't text her. I spoke to the Permanent Secretary.
Okay. Can you tell me when that was? Just so I've got a feel for the timeline.
I spoke to the Permanent Secretary on the 9th of November.
9th of November.
So can I just be clear, at that point, there was a concern had been raised.
Okay.
There's no complaint, so I've just been absolutely clear.
To be honest, we've kind of covered this before. Concerns and complaints to me, when it's serious misconduct, are the one and the same. I think you would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well, I'm very conscious that it did not become a complaint.
Sure. No, I get that, but the seriousness of it makes it something different. So just so I get the chronology right, you knew about the press story in relation to Edinburgh Airport on the 6th of November.
Yes.
You had a discussion with the Permanent Secretary on the 9th of November.
Yes.
And you were then appointed on the 11th of November to your new role with Pastoral Care.
So the pastoral care was really just an adjunct to my current role. It wasn't.
No, I understand that. It's just so I can get the timeline right. Can I make us look just a bit further ahead? And I've got two final questions for you. The first, obviously, by the time we get to August 2018, there was a police investigation underway. Okay, and I think you'd probably agree it would be inappropriate for anybody to have been in contact with potential witnesses or former civil servants.
Yes.
Did you have any such contact? Were you encouraged to email anybody?
No.
No, that's helpful to know. Obviously, we heard about text messages, and last week my colleague Murdo Fraser raised a text message from the Permanent Secretary, which was sent in January 2019. It said, "We may have lost the battle, but we will win the war." Was that to you?
No.
It wasn't to you?
No.
You didn't receive a text message like that? It's interesting. Okay. Did you have any discussion with the Permanent Secretary about that?
No.
Afterwards, nothing. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I have Allison Allen, please, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. You've touched on the issue there about the pastoral support that you provided and how that became a new part of your role. In some of the evidence submitted, or some of the evidence that we have, there is correspondence describing how that pastoral support was provided, particularly in the private office and communications at various points. Can you explain more about that and about how that role worked?
The pastoral care role.
Yes.
So it was really just to, I think the Permanent Secretary just wanted to make sure that if people had concerns about anything that was coming out in the media or anything like that, they had somebody to go to. So my physical location in St Andrew's House is just beside where most of the communications staff work, and it's one floor down from a lot of private office. So I was sort of physically available if people wanted to pop in for a chat, and it was really just to make sure that they had somebody that they knew they could come and talk to if they needed additional support.
So how did it work in that case? You mentioned there the press or the media side of this. How did it work if you were providing pastoral support at the same time as it would appear dealing to some extent with media inquiries? How did those two things relate to each other?
So in terms of media inquiries, so obviously a media team, so they would be picking up any media inquiries, etc. So the role, the pastoral care role, was really about just providing, making sure that individuals had somebody to come to if they wanted to, just raise.
So if somebody was approached by the press, it was your role was providing assurances to them rather than to the press.
So if people were approached by the press, on occasions they'd be anxious about how they should respond to that. So they would be given advice about what whether they had to respond, etc. So that would be general support to staff or media handling. The pastoral care one was literally just to be there if anybody wanted to come and say, I'm concerned that things are coming out, and this feels tough. Where can I go for support? So you would mention trade unions, you mention welfare officer, you mention the EAP, etc., the Employee Assistance Programme.
Can I ask more generally a point that came up in conversation with Sir Peter just now, which was about the apparent mismatch as the years went on between the concerns expressed in the staff survey and the number, this was the point that was raised with Sir Peter, the relatively low number of people willing to come forward to make complaints. Did you feel that in your involvement as things went on, that the civil service was learning from that difficult situation and was in any way overcoming some of the obstacles which stand in the way of people making such complaints?
So I think there are a range of ways people can raise issues, and I think going formal is quite a significant thing to do. But I think we have worked really hard at making sure that people have a lot of support. So Peter mentioned monthly conversations. We've got networks, people have mentors, line managers, trade unions, etc. So there's a number of ways that people can, I think, get support individually if they're, if they feel they want to discuss anything with people. So, I think that it's an area that over the years, in terms of our culture, successive permanent secretaries have invested heavily into being a much more supportive environment, etc.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I ask, just before I move on to Murdo Fraser, we've heard over the weeks about a sounding board that was in place. Is that the same role as the pastoral care role, or is it completely separate?
No, it was a separate role. They were both set up at the same time, but this was that's a separate role. And I understand a number of people approached the person who's doing that role, but I wasn't involved in that.
Okay, thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I was just going to say, given other members have covered the territory I was going to raise, to save time, I'm happy to pass on.
Oh, thank you very much for that. I do have another couple of members anxious to come back in. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm conscious that maybe others haven't had an opportunity to ask for the first time, so do they want to come in first? Oh, you've all been. Okay, thank you very much. It's just that my...
Oh, your colleagues are memorable to you.
My apologies. So thank you very much for bringing me back in, Convener. I'm very keen to explore further your role as the pastoral care support for the people that would go on to lodge formal complaints. Can I ask, when you were supporting them, did you ever get the impression that they had been encouraged to formalise their complaints by other civil servants?
So, if you're talking about two individuals specifically, I had very early, very limited contact with one, and slightly more contact with the second. And that contact effectively spoke to them and then handed them over, you know, as appropriate in terms of to HR, so that they were aware of the issues. I had no, there's no suggestion that they were being encouraged to come forward.
Okay. And in terms of after the collapse of the judicial review and thereby the collapse of the investigation, did you continue to support them in any way after that?
I've had no contact with one since November 17, and I have the second one since the middle of January 2018.
So you did have some contact at that point, after the judicial review judgment?
No, this was a year earlier, sorry.
My apologies, yeah, of course it is. The reason I ask this is this procedure clearly failed the very people it was designed to serve. It left women exposed and denied both any kind of recognition or any sense of justice. And I'm just keen, I think it's really important this committee understands the impact that would have on those women. And I'm concerned to hear that your pastoral role stopped before then. What kind of pastoral support was offered to these women after the collapse of the judicial review, or do you have no knowledge of that?
No, so it would not have been appropriate for me to have continued my contact with them beyond the initial contact I had. So I wasn't involved with the ongoing support for them. And, you know, I would imagine colleagues in People Directorate, you know, would have done that. So, but I wasn't involved in it. And
you're not clear that there was any formal pastoral officer appointed to them to support them in the aftermath?
I wasn't involved in that amount of detail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Can we just be clear that there are times when committee members are giving their view of a situation? And a supplementary question from Jackie Bailey.
Yes, this isn't a view. This is a question, Convener. Can I ask? I forgot to ask you earlier. Have you had any interaction with special advisors since November 2017? And I wonder if you could detail that.
I mean, so special advisors fall within my remit.
Just in general.
Whilst they're appointed by the First Minister for their board and lodgings, if you like, they fall within my remit. So I would have regular contact with special advisors.
Okay. Can I ask, since November 2017, have you had any contact about the issues before us? Either the policy, the judicial review, any complaints? Was there any interaction in relation to the issue before us?
So, not in connection with the policy development, judicial review. No, I don't remember anything. I don't recall any contact in relation to this.
Okay, so not prior to the Commission for Documents that you went and spoke at. There was nothing. I mean, I recognise memory has been an issue for the committee, but you know, it's quite important that if you can recall, that would be helpful.
So, so not about the specifics of the investigation or the development.
About the generalities of the investigation and development?
I mean,
any conversation?
So in terms of, yeah, there would be conversations with special advisors on occasions, yes.
Okay, so you know, whether it was the stuff of the water cooler moments that my colleague Alex Cole-Hamilton refers to, there was kind of general discussion, maybe not in great detail, but there was general discussion.
So not about specifics of any of the allegations?
No, but in, I'm trying to be as helpful as I can. Not about the specific allegations, but generally what was going on during this period in relation to the policy, the judicial review, etc.
So yes, so I would be in meetings where the special advisors would be there.
Okay. Did you have any knowledge of rotas being changed in any part of, you know, either private office or anything associated with ministers?
I was not aware of anything at the time. I subsequently have become aware.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
To round off this session, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. Ms. Allison, you mentioned that you had twice yearly meetings with the TUC and the Partnership Board and regular meetings with the TUC, the union members. Were you aware of why the unions insisted the revised fairness of work policy should include ministers?
I think they raised with us at the time, and I think in their evidence said that over a number of years before the 2010 policy, that they had concerns raised by their members. They had no specific concerns, and there was general concerns had been raised. They didn't raise anything specific with us, but my understanding was because of over a number of years, issues had been raised.
Specifically, that was about the behaviour in ministerial offices without, being any more specific than that.
I wouldn't even say it was about in ministerial offices, because, it might have been with policy officials, etc. So it wouldn't necessarily have been in connection with private office.
Right, I think I would need to go back, because it was my understanding that they had raised concerns about ministerial office behaviour, and that's why they had included ministers and insisted ministers would be covered by the Fairness at Work policy. And this was concerns raised with them by their union members.
So my understanding, recollection was it was general concerns about ministers' behaviour, and I'm not sure that I could confirm that it was about private office.
Well, ministers' behaviour then. Did you alert the Permanent Secretary or the Deputy First Minister about these concerns that the unions had raised?
There was nothing specific to alert the Permanent Secretary to. It was general. They were raising general concerns. There was nothing specific.
But don't you think that the Permanent Secretary and the Deputy First Minister should have been made aware you had a duty of care to the civil servant?
So just to be clear, sorry, we introduced the ministers into the 2010 policy on the back of general concerns that were being raised. To introduce that policy, the Permanent Secretary was clearly aware, because he was required to agree the policy, and the Permanent Secretary spoke to the First Minister at the time to bring that policy into place. So that was done in advance of the 2010 policy came into place. So the Permanent Secretary was aware we were changing the policy, and that the Permanent Secretary raised that with the First Minister at the time.
Right, and that was the First Minister. You didn't think it appropriate then to raise it with the Deputy First Minister, who under the Fairness at Work revised policy, had there been a written complaint, and I think that was quite a stumbling block and quite a huge obstacle to people, taking their complaints forward. You don't think it would have been appropriate to raise it with her?
We had no specific complaints to raise with the Deputy First Minister.
Did it have to be specific complaints if general complaints had been raised with the union about behaviour in ministerial offices?
I think that if I went to the Deputy First Minister and said, we've got general complaints, she would want some specifics. I mean, we weren't getting anything forward.
Mm-hmm. So did it concern you that people felt they could raise these with their unions, but they couldn't come to the people who they might have expected to have a duty of care and to be there with a policy to support them?
I think the unions, like ourselves, were concerned if there were issues that people weren't coming forward with. But it's up to the individual to decide how they want to deal with it. If they want to, I think Dave Penman was very articulate in his. People want to come and talk to them, but it's up to the individual whether they want to make a formal complaint or not. And if they weren't getting specifics, then they weren't getting anything to raise with us, and there's nothing that we could take forward.
Thank you.
That concludes our question session, and can I thank Barbara Allison for her evidence. It's the public evidence session concluded for today, and we'll now move into private session.